My dad loves to tell the story of the first time I ever jumped off the high dive. I was about 5 years old. We had just moved to a new city, and the world was shiny, new, and mine for the taking, starting with the high dive at our neighborhood pool. So I climbed that ladder, and I walked all the way to the edge so that just my big toes were sticking off. I looked down at the water, and immediately I felt afraid. So I backed away, and I walked all the way back to that ladder, and I started to climb down. See, I'm not exactly what you would call an adventurous person. I play by the rules, live permanently attached to my planner, and always color inside the lines. But sometimes I like to pretend that adventure is something I seek, and that taking risks would be something I would enjoy. College was supposed to be that adventure. It was going to be the first time I was living away from my parents. The first time I was completely responsible for how I spent my time and who I decided to spend it with. I was moving to a new state and a new school where I knew absolutely no one. It was my big step, my chance to take a risk and stop playing it safe. But I was fooling myself, because in reality, my first day of kindergarten was scarier than my first day of college. See, at the time, kindergarten was completely foreign territory. I had never been to school before, and I had no idea if it was going to be something I would enjoy or if I was going to completely fall on my face. I didn't fall. Turns out, academics is what I loved. It was something I knew. It was something I succeeded at. By the time I was in high school, I had found my niche. I was that girl that read under the covers with a flashlight, in the car, at the breakfast table, and even in the hallways during passing periods. And my love of knowledge wasn't just limited to books and literature. I spent hours discussing history with my grandfather, and dinner conversations with my dad routinely ended up in economic debates. So by the time college came around, I was so at home in my academic world that I saw no reason to leave. And likewise, until a few months ago, the obvious next step seemed to be grad school. But as I started looking at programs, the more I realized that I didn't have a clear idea of what I wanted to study. I was looking at schools not because I was interested in them, but simply because I was so terrified of entering the job market. I was using grad school as a safety net, a way to avoid my fears. So I decided not to apply to grad school. And with that decision came the panic. So now my fear is this: graduation. It sounds silly. After all, graduation is about celebrating. It's a way of saying, look at what I did. This is what I accomplished. But as May 7th approaches, I find myself focusing so much on what's next that I have completely lost sight of everything I've spent the last 3 years working towards. And just like that, graduation became a deadline. I can't see past that ceremony, and in the face of that uncertainty, I am afraid. I find myself asking questions like, will I get a job? Will I ever find a career? Can I actually become self-sufficient? And even worse, I find myself not knowing the answers to those questions, which, let me tell you, I do not like not knowing the answers. Math was always my favorite subject in school for that very reason. There's a right answer. None of this flowery tell me what you think nonsense. So not having the answers and not having the formula necessary to get the answers is a really scary thing. And up until about 3 months ago, I was still running from what scared me. And when that didn't work, I started telling myself all the reasons I wasn't afraid. But see, that's the funny thing about fear. We spend so much of our lives convincing ourselves that we're not afraid. When we're toddlers, we tell ourselves the monsters under our bed aren't real, and therefore we don't need to be afraid. But as we get older, those fears become more obscure, and they're harder to address. Turning on a light won't make the shadows disappear, and comforting words from a parent aren't going to make them go away. So instead, we put them in a box, stick a label on them, and proceed to pretend they're no longer there. Although my box looks more like those Russian nesting dolls. My fear of not getting a job, of hating my career, of disappointing all of those around me, can all be stacked up nice and neat inside one big box labeled fear of the unknown. Because really, isn't all fear just that? If we knew what the future held, there would be no reason to be afraid. I took a survey last month. One of the questions asked me, what are your plans for after graduation? The options were pursuing further education, employed, or seeking employment. Well, I have to say I fit firmly in the third category, seeking employment. It sounds so formal, so proactive, so completely adult. But what it really means is that I am spinning in circles, taking a wild stab in the dark at different cities, industries, jobs, trying to decide what the heck I'm going to do with the rest of my life. Although at this point, I would settle for what I'm going to do in the next year. According to my parents, the answer is get a job, any job. It sounds simple. I took the classes. I have the degrees. So in theory, I should be prepared to get a job, working in my field and using the skills I spent the last 3 years developing. But see, it's easy to forget how much work and preparation goes into a decision of this magnitude. It's easy to gather information on something we're already sure about. There's a reason our best subjects are usually our favorite subjects. It's searching for answers regarding something you fear that's so much harder. Loving academics as I did, I went to my first college fair when I was 14. I applied to 15 schools, and I made endless amounts of pro and con lists. And eventually, I narrowed the choice down to 2. I spent days trying to decide which choice was going to be the right one, where would I go to school, because I was so terrified of making the wrong choice. But now, I see that maybe there isn't one right choice, but 2. And that really it's our actions that follow that determines whether or not the choice was right. So I chose Tulsa. And with that decision, I made sure that my choice was the right choice. Which brings me back to this. I'm going to graduate from college with degrees in economics and business management. 2 degrees centered on what people like to call the real world. In theory, I know how to set up a business and turn it into a success. I know how to achieve desired results in a multitude of economic environments. On paper, I have the practical degrees and the necessary knowledge. But I'm less than a month away from graduating, and I still don't have a job. Because the truth is, there's no right major. There's no one degree or specific class that makes me any more prepared than anybody else joining me in walking across that stage. So where do I go from here? Well, I'd have to say the first step is to fill in the formula. Every question about the future that I'm facing is just a variable. And the more questions that I can answer, the less unknowns there will be. So why am I suddenly frozen? It's because all my plans and all my lists were geared towards one thing: eliminating my fear. I keep thinking that once I'm no longer afraid, then I will decide what's next after graduation. When I first began preparing for this talk, I was faced with some pretty conflicting emotions. Because in spite of being really excited and honored to be given a chance to talk to you today, I was faced with an overwhelming sense of fear and dread. And not solely because I'm afraid of public speaking, although I am afraid of public speaking, but because that I realized that in order to give this talk, I was going to have to finally confront all those doubts and fears that I had about graduation, even if I didn't think I was ready. So I pulled them up out of their box, and I began to think about what exactly is my next step. And you know what I came up with? I don't know exactly, but that's okay. Now, the color-coded schedule and to-do list maker in me is throwing a fit at just hearing the words, I don't know. Over-preparing and over-analyzing is what I do best. And in a way, that's what I've been doing for the last 15 years. I've been preparing myself for the next step. Every class I've taken, every book I've read, every career workshop I've attended have all been geared towards giving me the tools necessary to succeed in life after college. But now that it's here, I feel unprepared. But I guess that's the point. We never feel fully prepared to do what scares us. And eventually, we have to have the courage to act in spite of that fear. But why stop there? Instead of acting in spite of fear, we should act because of it. What is fear other than a call to action? Being afraid of a situation simply means that we are required to respond. We can move forward, or we can back away. In moving forward, there is risk. It isn't safe, and it isn't known. But life is full of unknowns, and it is our courage and our belief that what's in front of us is better than where we've been that drives us into action. About 3 rungs from the bottom of that diving board ladder, I stopped. And I looked at my dad, who was smiling encouragingly at me, and I looked at the ground. And I looked back at that board and climbed back up. I walked all the way back to the edge of that board and looked down at the water. And again, I felt afraid. I'm not standing up here today telling you that I am not afraid of graduation. There are too many unknown variables out there for me to be completely void of fear. But that's not going to stop me. So on May 7th, I'm going to walk across that stage, clench my fists, and jump.